think we'll get started. It's a couple minutes after 4. Well, thanks everybody for coming. This is the 5th Startup School in the series, I think. Sorry, 5th. How many of you have not been to any before today? Just one. Okay.
Something else,
Okay, not the Startup School part. Okay, that's fine. This could be a standalone thing, so you don't have to have been to one previously. How many people here are graduate students? Okay. How many people are alum? Okay. Who's here from somewhere other than the Washington Square campus, so Brooklyn or Medical Center? Okay, a good job. All right, very good. So today we're going to talk about testing your MVPs and prototypes. And I'm going to walk through what are MVPs and prototypes to begin with, what are their purpose and how can they help you as you think about starting a startup, and then tactically, how do you kind of put that into practice. So that's the goals for today. Definitely, as always, feel free to ask questions, stop me if anything I'm saying isn't clear, if you have anything you want to add from your own personal experiences, that would be great. Okay, so I want to level set a little bit. So many of you said you were here for previous startup schools, so some of this will be familiar to you, but just wanted to take maybe 5 minutes to talk about kind of how MVPs and prototypes tie in with what we've been talking about in prior weeks, and I'll kind of come back to that throughout the presentation to say, you know, we've talked about X, Y, and Z in the past, and this is where MVPs and prototypes kind of fit into that. So to start, I wanted to remind you of this quote by Paul Graham, who's the founder of Y Combinator. He said, "Starting a startup is something you can only learn intrinsically by doing it. What you need to learn is the needs of your own users." Right? So we spent a lot of time in the first 4 startup school sessions talking about how if you don't understand the needs of your users, you really can't build a successful startup, or you certainly can't do it efficiently, right? And so actually MVPs and prototypes are very helpful tools in helping you understand those user needs. So kind of drilling deeper into, okay, how do I actually go about understanding my customer? The MVPs and prototypes are a great way to get to know them, right? And so we talked in the early days about how you need to do this. You need to understand your customers before you finish designing and or building your product or service. So we gave examples and kind of told the cautionary tale of people who spend a lot of time and money and effort and resources building a final product only to kind of throw it over the transom to their customers and learn actually that's not what the customer wants or needs. Or maybe the customer likes it but they're not willing to pay for it, right? And all of that is necessary if you're going to build a successful business. So we talked about that. You know, don't build everything and then just hope and pray. That being said, you will get to a point in your conversation with customers as you're out in the market where you think, gosh, it would be really helpful if I could move this from just a conversation with words to maybe a demonstration of what I'm talking about. Or I actually think the customer might be able to help me think about at a more granular level now what my product or service might look like. And so as we kind of move on in your startup journey, you will come to a point where it won't just be conversations with customers, but actually you can begin doing the early days of building as a way to help you learn. And MVPs and prototypes are that early building. And I'll talk more about that. But again, you know, we're not saying, at no point do I want you to think, when I talk about building products today, they were talking about the finished product. It's really the early products, all for the purpose of helping you continue to get to know your customer more deeply. So we said before, you know, your job as the startup founder is not to validate your product, right? Your job is to validate a problem, understand who has that problem, and then how best to solve it, right? And that's still true. And we talked about customer discovery as a way for you to identify those problems, understand who the customer is specifically, who has it. And I would say MVPs and prototypes come in when you get to the third part of that process, which is how best to solve it. Prototypes and MVPs can help you think about that. Okay? So in the first lectures we said, the process that you should follow is to go in with an ingoing hypothesis of what the problem is, who the customer is, what a solution might look like, and all the different parts of your business model, right? We talked about how it starts with a series of guesses, and then your job as the founder is to turn those guesses into facts by talking to the customer and having the customer help you sort of validate what you believed and correct the things that you were wrong about, right? And we said the process looks like this, right? You start with a hypothesis about your business or your product, and then from there you design an experiment that's going to help you understand if that hypothesis is right or wrong. And in the early days, in the first 4 sessions of Startup School, when we talked about designing an experiment, it was really about figuring out who do I need to talk to and what do I need to ask them to help me understand if this hypothesis is right or wrong. And then we said, okay, you design that experiment, then you actually get out and you conduct that test, right? You have that conversation. And from that, you're going to get a whole bunch of insights that are going to help you validate or invalidate your hypothesis, that guess, that belief that you have, and modify it, importantly. And you kind of go around and around with all the different parts of your business model until you feel like these are no longer guesses, but facts that you've gotten based on what the market has told you, right? So this is the process that we have you follow. And that's still the process. Where MVPs and prototypes come in are in this stage and this stage. So what we're going to talk about today is when you get to the point where you're designing an experiment and you've had a bunch of conversations, but again, you kind of feel like you want to take the conversation a little bit further and you're starting to want to work with a customer to understand if the product or service you have in mind is right. The experiment is now about how do I use kind of physical product or representation of my idea to understand what the customer needs. And then how do I use that representation of my idea to kind of further that conversation with them and get better insights. So I just wanted to kind of set that context that this is still the process, and MVPs and prototypes just become sort of another tool that will help you go through that process better. Does anyone have any questions at this point? No? Okay, good. So MVPs and prototypes are the tools that help you test your hypotheses. Okay. So let's talk about what each of those things is. What is a prototype first? So a prototype, and there's a million definitions out there. This is just the one that I happen to think kind of was clearest to me. It's a model of a product or service built to demonstrate or test the feasibility of a concept. Okay. So a model of a product or service is the first part of that. So it may be physical, it may be experiential, but it could be a video. We'll talk about all the things that it could be. But what it is some sort of model of what you think the solution is going to be, okay? Not the end solution itself, but a model of it. And the purpose of a prototype is to demonstrate and to kind of put into reality the concept you have in your brain, and then use that to test with your customer if that concept kind of is resonating, or a specific part of that concept is resonating, okay? So when we think about prototyping, it's an iterative process first and foremost, where we start with that model, okay? And then we share that with our customer. We get feedback from that customer on that model. We refine it, and then we build another prototype that incorporates the learning that we had. So again, I'm showing you with like prototyping now at the center, that same process that I just described a couple of minutes ago. It's an iterative process of trying to build a model that represents your vision in some capacity, sharing it, getting feedback, and on and on. And when we talk about prototypes, there are kind of 3 words that I always keep in mind. The first one is that a prototype, especially at the very beginning, should be rough, okay? And keep that in mind. Typically, they're not perfectly, they're not extremely beautiful. They definitely don't work seamlessly all the time. Prototypes are meant to be rough, okay? And so especially as you're going through this the first time, the first prototype should be really rough so that you can get share it and get that feedback really quickly, okay? Then you want to go through this iterative process rapidly, So we talk about prototypes as a model that should evolve as you get customer feedback, and a good prototype is something that you don't feel bad throwing away and sort of iterating on very quickly, maybe multiple times in a single meeting with a customer, or multiple times in the course of a week or month, right? So going through this process rapidly is an important part of prototyping. And the whole goal is to get the product right, okay? And so every time you build the next version of your prototype, it should build on the last one, so you're getting a little more towards right, or you're turning that hypothesis or guess a little more towards fact with every time you go through this process, okay? All right, we're going to talk a lot more about prototypes in a second, but I want to take a second to talk about MVP. So MVP stands, in this context, for minimally viable product, okay? And this is Eric Ries's definition of what that is. Eric Ries is sort of the founder of the lean startup movement with Steve Blank, and a lot of the kind of methodologies we talk about have been popularized by Eric. And so he defines a minimally viable product as the version of a new product which allows the team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning about customers with the least effort. Okay, so again, it's all about trying to learn about your customer, an MVP is what is the fewest number of features or the least amount of work that I need to do to get to that learning. Okay, it's the fastest way to get to that learning. And so the two key words, right, are minimal and viable. So it's where minimum and viable come together, and here's what I mean by that. If something is too minimal and not viable, nobody's going to want to use it, right? If there's viable is when you may have a viable product that has all of the features and bells and whistles, right? But as a startup, you don't have the time, resources, or energy to build. So what you want to do is find where these two things intersect, and that is your MVP. So it has to have enough viability that someone wants to use it, but not so much that it would cost you a ton of effort and energy to build in case it's not what the customer wants. So we think about MVP as being kind of where those two things intersect. What's the least amount of things you need to do to still have a product that's viable enough that you can get to learning about your customer? Everybody with me on that? Okay. So what it really comes down to is what's that minimum feature set that gets to that intersection, okay? So typically, an MVP is distributed to customers. It's meant to be used in a relationship with a customer. And we'll talk about the different ways that relationship might happen. But it's meant to be used kind of to show or interact with a customer. And in many cases, MVPs can actually be used with large customer bases, right? You can kind of put it out into the world in many cases. And typically, we define an MVP as having enough functionality that the customer could use it on their own. So you don't have to do a lot of explaining about what it is. It's the minimum feature set that still allows them to extract value on their own from the product or service. And so this is a diagram that I think Eric initially put together that I think describes the concept really well. So if our concept was for a car, right, you might think, okay, I'm going to build the first part of a car. I'll build the wheel and then the axis and then a little bit of the body and then the rest of the body. But the fact is, the purpose of a car is to get you from point A to point B, right? The problem it solves is getting you from point A to point B. And a wheel on its own doesn't do that for the customer. So it doesn't actually have the viability to solve the problem that we're trying to learn about. On the other hand, that doesn't mean we have to build the whole car to validate whether or not we understand the customer's problem, right? Instead, maybe we build a skateboard and we understand how the customer gets to point A to point B, we understand that problem, we engage with them on that problem, but the skateboard has enough viability that the customer can use it to start to understand that use case, right, that customer need. And from there, we can start adding to it until we eventually get to the car as we learn from customers about what they want and they need. So it may be, okay, initially it's not stable enough, we have to add something for stability. Okay, we learned that from the customer. How can we test what type of stability is stable enough? And you kind of can go through the process. It's sort of a silly example, but the reason I like it is because what it kind of gets to is that viability means it's the minimum number of feature set around the problem that your customer is trying to solve. So if you keep that at the front, then you can understand, how minimal can my first iteration be on that MVP. Okay, so I thought a lot about this before presenting to you guys today. What's the difference between a prototype and an MVP? And the truth is, I read a lot about it in the last few days, and there isn't consistency or uniformity across, especially in the context of startups, about what the difference between these two things are. As I kind of read what different experts say about it, or even just companies and how they use the term. So I'm not going to get caught up in semantics, but I think for the purposes of our conversation, I'm going to kind of summarize what I thought was the best descriptions of what the difference between these two things are. But you should know, when you're out in the world and talking to people, a lot of people use these terms interchangeably. Okay? I'm not going to today, but a lot of people do. And so just keep that in mind. So for today, and going forward when you talk to me, when I talk about prototypes are really about, for me, in this context, testing product or service design. So when I'm going to talk about prototypes, I'm really talking about the product or the service specifically. Okay? When we talk about MVPs, to me that means testing business hypotheses. Now, you may use your prototype to help you test by using certain processes a business concept. Okay? But when I talk about a minimal viable product, the product needs to be helping you test not just the design of the solution itself, right, but a part of the business model. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. But just for context setting, that's how I'm defining the difference between those two things. Prototypes are really about product and service. Minimally viable product is how you use that product or service to test a business model hypothesis. Okay? Yes?
So in your example before, could a prototype have just part of the solution? Could it just be the wheel, and that's okay?
Yeah, it might. And I'm going to show some examples where you might see it's not enough to help you. It will help you learn something, right, about the wheel, but not enough that the customer could use it on their own to test the whole part about your business model. Okay? Now, the key takeaway, and I think a lot of the reason why these two things get used interchangeably, is that they both serve the same end goal. Okay, the end goal in both is about understanding your customers' wants and needs, and then importantly, how you as an entrepreneur can help satisfy those wants and needs. And that's why they get used interchangeably, because they're both driving towards that same goal. And often a prototype helps you test the business model and how you would serve that customer. Okay? I did like this diagram. It's not perfect, but it kind of crystallized it for me a little bit. This is a sketch of a donut. Okay? In my definition, the sketch of a donut is a prototype. Right? You could have a conversation about a customer, which is does it have a hole in it? Does it not have a hole in it? Does it need to be round? How thick should it be? All of that kind of stuff. But the customer can't, eat the paper, right? It doesn't operate on its own. But once you got to a point with the customer, you could say, okay, it needs to be round, it needs to have a hole in it, it should be approximately this size. Now you could build kind of a simple version of that might help you test, would someone actually buy this if I were to create it, right? If I created the things that we described with in that sketch, now I can test, well, how much would someone pay for something like that? And could I distribute it online, or do I need to set up a store? Could I drive it around in a delivery truck, right? All those things. So a plain donut may be kind of the simplest number of features that you need to have to start to test those parts of your business model. Oops. Sorry, we got disconnected here. And then the product, right, and this is kind of a silly example, but that helped me think it through, is a donut with chocolate and sprinkles on it, right? So you don't need the chocolate and sprinkles for you to understand, should I can I sell this online or through a delivery truck, or do I need to set up a store, right? But ultimately, you may learn, gee, the customer really, a plain donut isn't what the customer wants. They need kind of more features for it to be something they'd actually be willing to buy, and so over time, you drive towards that. When Palm created the pilot, that wasn't something that customers did at all. And so there was an important question around form factor that they had to answer. If we had something approximately this size and shape, would it fit in the pocket of someone's pants? Or would people put it in the breast pocket of their dress shirt? And so they really could learn a lot about what was comfortable and not comfortable for people by using just simple foam or blocks of wood to prototype it. And it seems silly now, but actually they learned a lot about how thin it needed to be and how tall it could be and all of that. And the fastest way to do that was to create them in lots of different sizes and shapes, give them to customers, and have them kind of walk through the pros and cons of something in that size and shape. Okay? So this was the first version of the prototype. This is what a second or third version of the prototype looked like. So now they're testing something different. Keep in mind, again, at this time, styluses, is that the plural of stylus? Styli? Were not something that we used every day, right? So they had to test, okay, this is actually a chopstick that they shaved down. They didn't have to create anything new. They said, okay, if we were to put information on a screen that was like this, and we said, use this chopstick, the shaved down chopstick, what would you do, consumer? How would you think about what to do with this? How intuitive is it that you use the tip of the stylus to write like this and to tap like this? And so they were able to learn a lot. And what you can see here is this prototype is made out of paper, and the stylus is made out of a chopstick. And again, they could learn a lot about, they had a hypothesis about what the customer was going to do with the chopstick and the piece of paper. But to test that hypothesis and understand if it kind of fit what the user wanted and needed, they put it in the hands of the customer and observed how that worked. Okay? So there are lots of different reasons to prototype, and they come in different forms. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the different forms of prototyping, and then we'll talk about different circumstances in which you might use the different forms. So the first type of prototype is just, let's prototype the physical form of the product we're building. So the wood block is another example of physical form that Palm used. But this is another project that IDEO did. So IDEO was doing a project for Sam Adams, and they were tasked with helping them redesign the tap that goes into all the bars. And you can see here, all the way to the left here, is what the tap used to look like. And they were like, it blends in with everybody else's. It doesn't stand out when someone walks up to the bar to order a beer. Sam Adams is not what they're seeing right away. So we want to redesign it. Now, there are lots of things that needed to go into the redesign. They had to test color and things like that. But one very important customer for Sam Adams is not just the person who drinks the beer, but it's the person who pours the beer, right? So they had to think about, how do we create a product that not only is visually appealing to the drinker of the beer, but that will work in the context of all the other taps that are there and is comfortable for the bartender and so on and so forth. So this is an example of using foam to build a prototype, right? So these are all just made out of foam. They literally shaved them down, and you can see what they did first had no colors or words or anything on it. They were just trying to understand what would the handle feel like and how would the handle sit next to other handles on the bar. And so they went through a number of iterations and learned a variety of things. Now, they built these, and then they showed them to bartenders, and they showed them to customers, and they had people actually use the foam version to kind of pull it down, and they learned a whole bunch from that. And from that, they said, okay, now we have an idea of generally what the form should look like. Now let's think about how will that blend with the colors that Sam Adams asked us to use and the way that their logo is going to sit on it. And so they moved to kind of later versions of that same prototype, where they said, okay, the logo shows up slightly better on some of these than on others. And if we put the logo in one that looks like this, definitely the bartender's hand is going to cover it when they're pouring, and that's no good, right? So there's a lot that they could learn just by building using foam, and at later stages a little bit of paint and stickers to test the physical form of the product they were trying to build. So physical form prototypes are one type of testing that you can do. Another thing, another kind of way that prototypes help you is to help you understand how a product might work. Now, this isn't anything about what it'll look like necessarily, but you're trying to understand the mechanics of how it will work. So again, another IDEO project. They were doing a project in a city that was trying to solve for the fact that there were a lot of bike accidents. And so they had this idea. Their concept was, what if we put a light on the back of a bicycle that when a car was approaching it and getting too close, it would signal to the driver that there was a danger, they were getting too close. So they built a prototype that they were able to build in an afternoon that tested that concept, and they said, could we make that work? So this is about how would the product actually work. So I'm going to show you a little video of it, see if I can. So can you guys see what's happening? So, right, a little sad face happens when the driver gets close, and then it goes back. Now, you're getting the driver's attention with the light, so they see you, but then the sad face goes on when they get too close, right? Now, this is super ugly. This is nothing about the form, the product form, right? You can see the wires and everything else. But they could test the concept, A, can we build it? And B, if we build it, does our customer, in this case, the driver of the vehicle, understand what it means intuitively? They had a hypothesis that the sad face would be intuitive enough that having it work this way would be good. So this is an example of a works-like prototype. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there are prototypes that don't function at all, but what you're trying to test is what should the product look like, okay? So this is actually very common, you guys may or may not know. When new cars are being designed, they build them in lots of different materials before they actually build the first real body of a car. For early prototypes are on paper and kind of online models, but they even go so far as to build them in things like clay, so they can actually have a full-size model of what it might look like, and then they can walk around it, they can have customers walk around it, and they can get a lot of feedback about the look of the car before investing in expensive materials to build it. Okay, so this is an example of looks-like prototypes. And then let's put those two things together, right? So you can have prototypes that actually bring together a works-like and a looks-like prototype. So you test sort of the whole thing, again, without having to have something at full fidelity. So this is another ideal project, a cool project that they did with HP, where they were building a wireless turntable. Okay, that's what you're looking at here, is a wireless turntable. And the first thing they needed to ask is, can we build a works-like prototype? Can we build a small wireless turntable that'll actually work in the way that we're envisioning? And so that's what they built up here. It's ugly. You would have no idea what it was for. But they put together kind of the wires and the mechanics of it, and they could, yes, actually, we could build something that works. The works-like prototype was a success, and we achieved that. Then they built this, and this didn't work at all. This was the looks-like prototype. And they said, okay, how big does it need to be? Where do the finger holes, where should they go? If it didn't come with instructions, would someone understand how to hold it and how to use it? Should it have the wood on it? Is that cool or is that not cool? And so they had to kind of build what it looked like and show that to customers and get feedback from customers about that. And then they were able to just put those two things together with hot glue. Right? So if they were actually manufacturing these things, it'd be really expensive. But what they were able to do is say, we have this works-like prototype that's sort of kludgy and ugly looking. We can kind of hot glue it with this looks-like prototype, and we can get pretty close to what our final product would look like, and we could give that to customers, and now we can understand even more questions, and understand the answers to even more questions. So kind of as you move in later fidelity, you can put works-like and looks-like prototyping together. Again, this is an example of an experience or service prototype. I told you about this. This was done by a company called Continuum. They're like IDEO, a design and innovation firm. And they were helping new concept restaurants. I believe this one was actually at an airport as well. And so they were trying out different designs. And you could think about even like if you were building a new restaurant and you're trying to decide where should the bar go and where should the kitchen go and where does the concierge stand and what if we had tables set up like this, you can test, like, does the flow of traffic work, and are people's vision cut off, or can you see the way you need to see? And so there's a lot about an experience that you can prototype, again, just by kind of mocking something up with, foam core chairs or whatever, cardboard and things like that. So even the experience part of a product or service can be prototyped in this way. So where do you begin? How do you know which of these kinds of prototyping methods or types of prototype is right for you? Well, it's really about asking yourself first, what's the most important design question that I have? And that's what you need to do first, right? So the focus of your prototype in the early days should be, well, what is the most pressing question? I like to call these deal-killing assumptions, right? What is the thing that if I'm wrong about it, it might kill my entire concept? Is it the way it works that I'm worried about? Is it the way it looks? Is it the way the customer would experience it? And so, over time you may need to test all of those things, but you should always start with the thing that is the riskiest for you. And so before you even worry about what prototype am I going to build, you and your team need to ask the question, what is the thing that scares us the most? What is the thing that's most likely to trip us up? And if you can really understand that, then you can say, okay, now what is the right experiment design to help us test that thing? Again, back to that process. It's about designing an experiment that tests the most important hypothesis that you have at that moment. And so the type of prototype you would use is dependent on what the riskiest hypothesis is in that moment in time. Okay. So I now want to talk about kind of why we prototype and I show you some more examples that I think illustrate the point. But the first reason we prototype is kind of almost so simple that it gets lost. There was a study done by these three folks. Actually, Norton was one of my professors in graduate school. He's a really cool guy. And he studied the effect of how people value things when they build them themselves. When you build, so in entrepreneurship, you can see this as like an important concept. If you build a product or service, how much do you value it versus one that you would buy or that someone would give you? And they found this thing that they've called the IKEA effect, which is they found that when you build something yourself, you value it way more than you should. Right? That's why we all value IKEA furniture maybe and have trouble throwing it away. You're like, oh, but I spent that entire day building that dresser or whatever, right? And it's totally true when it comes to the products or service that we build for startups. When we build an app and we spend tons of time coding it, or when you sew a piece of apparel that you think you're going to be able to sell someone, you have invested yourself in that, and you include that in the value of the product or service. But keep in mind, the customer is not going to, right? The value to them is entirely dependent on how much it helps and improves their life, not how much time, effort, or energy you poured into it, right? And so we prototype to help us escape this feeling, to get us used to the feeling of, well, if I just build something quickly and cheaply and it doesn't work, it's okay to throw it away, or it's okay to really modify it. Let's do it quickly and cheaply and learn that our value is not tied with the value of this product, but rather in getting to something that the customer is going to want and need. So we prototype to help us kind of extract our value from the value of our product and then be able to iterate and actually address the customer's needs more effectively. So why prototype? Well, first, prototyping helps us learn in a way that enables us to fail safely and fail quickly, right? Rather than, again, going back to this model of I'm going to build a product or service and just hope and pray that someone wants it because I've spent all this time, effort, and energy on it, right? So this is an example of that. I love this example. It's true. It's real. It exists in Boston. It's a restaurant called Clover, and they created a food truck where they test out new recipes and different things. And so you can, it's hard to see on here, but the side of the van is entirely white, and they actually, it's like whiteboard paint. They actually write in dry erase marker what they're serving that day. If something's not going well by halfway through the day, they literally erase it and write something else. So you can imagine it's super iterative prototyping that they're hearing from customers like, I want that, but leave off the sauce, right? And it's like, okay, well, let's save money on sauce. Nobody likes the sauce. Or certain things just nobody orders. They can even try just changing the name of a product, not even what the product is, right? So they can test a lot of different things in this food truck before they actually would implement it in a restaurant where they have to worry more about sort of like process flows and product procurement and all of that kind of stuff. So it's kind of an example of how prototyping can help you learn things you're not doing well really fast in a safe environment. And kind of on that, this is one of the founders of IDEO, Tom Kelly, and he said, fail often so you can succeed sooner, right? The more you can learn about what not to do early on, the faster you're going to get to what you should be doing for the customer, which is ultimately going to be your success. Okay, so why else to prototype? To learn what we don't know, right? I love this example. If you prototype well, you should always be surprised, right? You should be surprised by how the customer responds to things. You should be surprised by what form factors work and don't work. But prototyping helps you test things out early so you don't become surprised by something that is a deal killer to your business later on. Okay. We prototype to help us co-design and collaborate. And that might be with our customer, it might be with our teammate, it might be with an investor, it might be with an industry expert. But prototyping helps collaboration. I think this is a good example, sort of a famous IDEO example again. So these guys in this room here are surgeons and healthcare professionals. And they were tasked with building a new medical device that was going to help kind of see up into the nasal cavity, okay? Which is like a difficult thing to do, and existing tools at this time really didn't do that very well. So what they started with is a meeting to talk about what works and what doesn't work and how might you improve that. And so you can see they have like a model of a head here, and they're waving their hands. You can see this guy is going like this, and he's like, well, what if we did this, and what if we did that? And so there's a lot of gesturing going on. There's not really any prototyping happening yet, but there's a conversation. And then someone brilliantly is like, oh, I know. And he grabs a marker and a roll of tape and a clothespin, and it's like, what you're describing when you go like this, does it look like this? And the guy said, no, it doesn't look like this. You need the pen, move the pen a little. And if you move the pen a little, then we can get up the head. And so now they're prototyping, right? They're no longer trying to explain what's in their mind, but they're showing what's in their mind, and they're able to improve upon what's in each other's mind by working together on a simple product, right? And what they ultimately get to is something that looks like this, actually not that different than the shape of this. But they only kind of got here by first starting with early versions where they were able to kind of throw away the tape and retape it in a different direction and kind of together collaborate on what it should look like. So it takes what's in your mind, brings it into a form that others can look at, right? A model that others can look at and iterate on and collaborate to get to a better solution more quickly. And then, of course, we prototype to get user feedback. All of this is about getting feedback. This is an example of a project I worked on when I was an innovation consultant. The product's called Chotacool, and it is a cooler. It's a refrigerator replacement that's used in rural India. So most homes in rural India do not have refrigerators, but they of course have need for some refrigeration. And so if you kind of go in thinking what we need is to bring refrigerators to rural India, you realize very quickly there are lots of reasons why that doesn't work. That there's not a business model there that works. And so what the Insight team did was spend time in rural India with the users of this and understand what their needs are. They co-collaborated with the customer on a product that ultimately was a standalone cooler. It did not need any electricity. It was very small and pretty inexpensive, but it solved the user's need, which is basically keep a gallon of milk cool for long enough that my family can use it before it spoils. And so by coming out with first coolers, and then coolers that had things taped onto them, and then coolers that had compression built into them to keep it cool, they were able to get user feedback and iterate quickly in an environment, in the environment of the user. And then, we prototype to align people, to align our teammates, our partners, our potential customers. Again, kind of going back to, it's hard to explain what's in your mind, right? You're kind of like gesturing, and what if we did this, and what if we did that? And that can be a really hard way to align a team, especially if what you're doing is something that really has never existed before, if it's really different. It may be clear to you, but if there isn't sort of an existing model or analogy, it can be really hard to explain to someone else. So we prototype to take what's out of our head and get alignment with the people, the stakeholders that we need to be aligned with.